Some pepper.
It can be said America has a love affair with meat. Land is dedicated to it. Fields of crops are fed to make it. Towns are built around it. Awards are given for it. Some may even say meat is worshipped. But the world may be joining the love affair. Population is on the rise. Are U.S. producers ready for the challenge of feeding the world? Can industries keep up with demand while staying within the limitations of the environment? Consumers know more than ever about their food. Can the global appetite be satisfied in a way that is palatable, or will new alternatives set the table? What is the future of meat? Feeding the world. In the Midwest, that's a phrase you hear quite a bit. This is the world's breadbasket, but it's also the meat counter. Putting meat on plates across the U.S. is already a huge undertaking for the agriculture industry. Keeping that up is going to be a challenge. Coming up, we'll hear about how meat shapes the Midwest, why producers are trying to control their carbon footprint, how consumers are influencing animal treatment, and what kinds of meat could be on your plate in the future. But first, let's set the table and look at the business of making meat in America right now.
A lot of other U.S. industries have become less made in the USA. But red, white, and blue consumers can usually count on seeing these labels on their beef, chicken, and pork. That may be part of the reason the U.S. consumes more meat per person than almost any other country in the world. But global population is on the rise. It just passed 7 billion and is projected to reach 9.6 billion by 2050. Along with that, the global middle class is rising. And that's important because there's a simple rule that humans follow. The more money a country has, the more meat its citizens eat. So countries with historically low meat consumption are going to be eating more. Americans already play a big role in feeding the world. The U.S. is the #1 exporter of poultry meat, and thanks to a huge increase in demand from China, the #1 exporter of pork. In beef exports, #4, behind India, Brazil, and Australia. Meat is already big business in America. Can it get bigger?
We're going to project forward now.
Meat demand is a very interesting part of the global food picture. In fact, it's one of the most fascinating parts.
Thomas Hurtel spends a lot of time thinking and talking about the future. Specifically, the future of food.
I think if we want to look forward 4 decades, we should look backwards 4 decades.
What Hurtel sees in the past is promising. Since the 1960s, global agricultural output has tripled. And while doing that, the land dedicated to agriculture has increased very little, less than 20%.
There are issues related to that, but it is nonetheless a remarkable accomplishment. And the question is, can we keep that track record up?
The answer to that question starts in the present. The story of meat is in towns like Lexington, Nebraska, where not only do they eat meat, but they rope it, wrestle it, and ride it. Lexington is surrounded by ranches and feedlots that raise cattle, and fields of corn and soy that feed them. Not only that, but this is where thousands of cattle come each day to be turned into ribs, loins, chuck, and rounds at the Tyson meatpacking plant. Tyson employs over 2,700 people in Lexington, and the influence can be readily seen on the demographics of this town of 10,000.
There are some things I can do to help me learn English.
Immigrants from places like Mexico, Ghana, and Sudan come to Lexington to work at Tyson. At this community center, new residents are taking English classes.
I say yes, everything. I can do everything.
The main that I come here is to get a job.
Omar Ahmed learns English during the day before the late shift at Tyson. An immigrant from Ethiopia, he was surprised that the production line never stopped.
I think every day they kill like 2,600. At the first time when I came, I say, what happened? The cow is not finished. Every day like 2,600. That is a lot. When they finish, no, still there is good. That is amazing for me.
Omar uses his job to send money home to family in Africa. He likes Lexington. It's safe, he says, and quiet. And while he might look for jobs outside of Tyson, he'd like to bring his family to live here. Lexington is a snapshot of just how closely tied local economies and cultures can be to the meat industry. And these towns are all over the United States. In fact, the meat map of the U.S. shows definitive regions of meat production comprised of towns just like Lexington. Beef mainly in the Plains states from the Dakotas to Texas, pork concentrated in the Midwest around Iowa, and most of our poultry coming from the South and Southeastern states. These are populations sustained by an appetite, and they're looking to grow. In Lexington, Tyson is building a new refrigerated warehouse, a $47 million investment. Communities like this have a vested interest in the future of meat, and they put the U.S. out front, leading the world in producing meat and eating it. But there are obstacles ahead: a changing climate, changing consumer attitudes, and a debate about what meat will look like on the plate in the future. As the industry works through those challenges, towns like Lexington are going to be along for the ride.
Things are looking pretty good for the Cowboys. Nope.
Meat drives the economy in many communities in the Midwest and other parts of the country. But the process of making meat also has a global impact on the environment and the climate. According to the United Nations, 14% of human greenhouse emissions come from livestock. That includes everything from the fuel and fertilizer it takes to grow feed to the waste the animals put out themselves. But not all animals have the same footprint. When you break it down, 8% of livestock emissions come from poultry, about 9% come from pork, and then there's beef. Beef cattle account for 40% of global livestock emissions. That's weighing on the industry. And next we'll visit two farms with different ideas on how to grow without adding to that climate impact. Joan Ruskamp starts her day checking the lots at her feed yard near Dodge, Nebraska.
I'll make sure everybody gets up. You know, if there's a lame one, he'll tend to stay laying down, so we want to make sure they're up and moving.
Meanwhile, her husband Steve serves up a breakfast of hay and corn to 4,000 hungry cattle.
There's an exact amount of pounds that each pen will receive. Younger cattle that are growing have more hay and less corn. Cattle that are finishing and putting on more muscle are getting more corn and less hay.
Nebraska has more than 2 million cattle in feedlots like this, making it one of the top cattle feeding states in the nation. But whether it's a feedlot in Nebraska, Kansas, or Texas, it's built to fatten up cattle in a hurry. In only 6 months' time, they can pile on around 1,000 pounds of meat. Joan Ruskamp says the secret is their stomach.
Cattle have a rumen that does amazing things with feed. So they're eating all these things I don't want to eat, and they're giving me a great burger, a great steak, a great roast to eat in the end.
But the same cow stomach that turns corn into meat also has a troubling side effect. As they eat corn or grass, cattle regurgitate methane, a greenhouse gas many times more powerful than carbon dioxide. In fact, when it comes to global greenhouse gas emissions, cattle are one of the worst offenders.
If you look globally and you just compare every sector, I'm talking electric utilities, steel, automobiles, beef, globally, beef is at the top, okay? The highest emissions per dollar of output, higher than electric utilities globally.
The cattle industry is trying to get a grip on how to reduce that footprint. Kim Stackhouse Lawson is the sustainability director for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. She's been researching which parts of the industry contribute the most emissions.
70% of beef's carbon footprint actually happens on the ranch, at the cow-calf level.
Stackhouse Lawson says, in a way, the U.S. actually has a head start over the rest of the world when it comes to controlling the carbon footprint of cattle. And that's because U.S. feedlots are the most efficient at turning pounds of feed into pounds of beef.
Cattle have gotten bigger. That's from genetic improvements, so we've been very focused on maximizing resource use.
Go back 50 years to 1965. At that time, a steer went to slaughter weighing right around 1,000 pounds. Today, with better beef genetics and nutrition, that same animal weighs over 1,300 pounds. With fewer cattle, the U.S. produces 30% more beef. If the rest of the world was as efficient as the United States, it would go a long way in cutting global greenhouse emissions from cattle. But not every country can grow feed like the Midwest. And some believe the current system relies too much on fields of corn and soybeans that add to the environmental cost. They want to move beef away from feedlots and row crops.
We're rewriting history. We want to change the way things are done, and we want to do it with a group of cattle that fit with our nature situation and for a lot of other people. So, suck yeah, girlies. Come on, let's go, girls. Suck yeah.
Del Fike raises cattle in southeastern Nebraska. They never go to a feedlot. Instead, they start and finish their lives feeding on pasture, designed to grow on grass, not grain.
They're engineered to do everything on forage like cows were intended.
The switch to grass-fed beef was a huge change for Fike. Until a couple years ago, he farmed 7,000 acres of corn and soybeans and fed cattle in a conventional feedlot. Now he's down to around 500 acres, nearly all grass.
You can have more cows, more pounds, and do it in a way that is better for the environment if you use the right genetics.
Fike says keeping cattle on grass takes crops like corn and soybeans out of the picture, along with the fuel and fertilizer needed to grow them. That cuts carbon emissions. Also, planting prairie where crops used to be pulls excess carbon out of the air and stores it in the soil.
This was all cropland, so this would be highly erodible land.
It's true grass-fed cattle do a lot to save carbon, but strictly in terms of greenhouse emissions, they're still at a disadvantage. Kim Stackhouse Lawson says it's because of efficiency. At the feedlot, she says a calf is ready for slaughter by the time it's 18 months old.
If we were grass finishing an animal, they might be anywhere from 2 to 2.5 years old before they reach the same finished endpoint.
Since grass-fed cattle have more time before slaughter, they typically have a larger footprint. But Stackhouse Lawson says at the same time, keeping cattle on pasture provides benefits for wildlife habitat and water.
A grass-finished system might have a smaller water footprint because oftentimes irrigation is used to water crops. So it's a trade-off, and it's about balancing those trade-offs.
There are different ways to meet the growing appetite for beef in the U.S. and abroad, and they each have something to offer. Feedlots are efficient.
The whole reason I'm here doing this is to feed people.
Grass is green.
Just let the cow be a cow.
But that's the challenge for the beef industry in a climate-conscious world, finding a way to meet that demand while keeping the carbon footprint of cattle in check. So meat producers are aware of the impact their product is having on the climate and the environment. But how meat is made in the future won't be up to only them. Consumers are becoming more aware of what happens before a package of chicken breasts or pork chops reaches the supermarket. They're pressing for changes in how animals are raised. As we see in this story, some big players in the meat industry are responding, but there's competition from some small companies making transparency a selling point.
Chipotle says it's being forced to disappoint pork lovers all across the country. The chain
January 14th was a very bad day for fans of the Chipotle Carnita. That's when the company announced they discovered that one of their major pork suppliers had failed to meet their animal treatment standards. The result? Pork pulled from the menu indefinitely in many locations.
You guys feeling all right?
While music is the main attraction at these Cultivate festivals, staged around the country by Chipotle, there are also plenty of reminders around the grounds of, among other things, the company's commitment to the concept of responsibly raised pork.
We understood there was a risk. I mean, you're taking something out of your restaurants that people like. Instead of there being outrage that people couldn't get carnitas in some of our restaurants, the response has really largely been kudos for walking the talk and for standing on principle.
And it's not just Chipotle. McDonald's has also taken a strong stance on the way meat in its supply chain must be handled. Even industry giants like Smithfield Foods and Tyson have committed by 2017 to end the practice of keeping pigs in gestation crates that severely limit their mobility. It takes time for large companies to institute change, but having heard the demand for transparency, small businesses like this one in Kansas City's East Bottoms are answering with a personal touch.
People want that relationship with whatever the product is. It doesn't have to be meat. They want a relationship with the people that are providing them those goods and services. And so that's what we're here for.
So you're gonna take your knife, you're gonna cut right in.
Weekly classes at the local pig bring customers one step closer to some firsthand knowledge. This one's centered on sustainability, exploring ways to use the whole hog.
This is wonderful. I mean, I'm not going to be able to go home and do this, but I at least have an understanding of how it works.
It's more finesse than a lot of people think it is. It's kind of enlightening how much care you have to take as you're butchering it.
For this small shop, local means animals raised without antibiotics within 100 miles of Kansas City. That small scale also makes it easier to maintain an ongoing dialogue with their suppliers.
For meat to have a future in the average person's diet, people are going to have to eat less of it. And because they're eating less of it, they're going to be even more focused on, if I'm eating less, I'm definitely going to up the quality of the meat that I'm eating.
Caring enough to pay a little more is what Hart Brand Beef is counting on from consumers. This ranch near Austin, Texas, has been raising Akaushi cattle since 1994, when a specially equipped 747 brought 8 cows and 3 bulls across the Pacific.
All the cattle that we're seeing here today are direct descendants of the Akaushi from Japan. And we take the full-blood Akaushi bulls and put them on regular commercial or domestic cattle, and even with that 50% Akaushi, still able to produce really great, delicious beef.
Flavor is, of course, highly subjective. But as a breed, Akaushi excel at producing intramuscular fat, i.e. marbling, which usually correlates with high-end eating. Bill Fielding, who'd spent his career working for companies like Cargill and Farmland, was skeptical at first, but this experience with small meat has changed his tune.
We've got now 6 years of history which show crossing Akaushi bulls with any other cows. On average, we come up with 30–35% prime. Consistency, quality, and taste, the consumer has always said that's what they want, and the industry has not responded.
The consumer wants to know where his beef came from, so we do not buy our cattle randomly. Everything we buy is sourced from a specific ranch and also sourced from a specific Akaushi bull.
What we're doing is darn sure different. We're not just another seed stock operation with another breed that you see on the side of the road. We're different, but I say for all the right reasons.
For Hart Brand, finding the right size niche in an industry dominated by a handful of giants won't be easy. Capital costs are huge, and resistance to change is ingrained. But according to Fielding, this time, the right elements are in place.
I wish I was still running one of the big companies, because knowing what I know now, I would absolutely put top priority behind this program and getting these genetics out.
In the U.S., consumers have all kinds of choices, from prime cuts at a boutique butcher shop to ground chuck at the grocery store. But for consumers in the developing world, the question has not been what kinds of meat to buy, but whether they can afford meat at all. That dynamic is changing. A rising global middle class is finding meat to be an affordable luxury, and U.S. producers want to capture these new consumers. The question is, what will they eat? There are some new alternatives coming on the scene, hoping to take a cut of the meat market from beef, chicken, and pork. Coming up next, we take a look at what kinds of meat the U.S. will be serving up in the future.
Okay, first time in the grub state? Yep. All right, so the spiel.
We have yak, beef, buffalo, elk.
At Grubstake in Estes Park, Colorado, tourists drop in daily to try out new options, and their favorite meal is yak.
If you've never had yak before, I highly recommend it. It's a really clean flavor, lean meat. It tastes more like beef than anything.
It looks and cooks like beef, too.
Every year it's grown more and more. More than a third of all the burgers we sell are yak. All right, we'll go in the kitchen and cut them cut.
The cowboy yak. Thank you.
Yak and beef may look the same on the dinner plate, but not on the ranch. Ryan Holland runs 7H Yak Ranch in Calhan, Colorado. He's raising 12 yak and says they're good for the environment. Yak are smaller than cattle, so they need less food and less water, and they produce less waste.
These animals are healthy, these animals are good. There's so many benefits to having these animals, it just only makes sense. It only makes sense.
And yak are considered a leaner meat, or a more healthy option than beef products. Holland says the cattle industry should look at incorporating more yak, and maybe someday, yak will be a mega industry too.
I think with, information out there, with training and education, I think it could easily be the very same thing. We have it for cattle, so why couldn't we have it for this?
For starters, there aren't very many yak. According to the International Yak Association, there are only 2,100 registered yak in the United States. Compare that to the 2.1 million cattle slaughtered in just 1 month in the United States. Those are not the kind of numbers of yak that will feed the world.
The estimate is that we'll need to produce 100% more food by 2050.
Keith Belk says that if America is going to feed the world, it's going to be with the big three: pork, beef, and chicken. These are established industries made for mass consumption. So where do we find that increase we need by 2050?
And 70% of that will have to be based on additional technology.
That's what researchers are working on at CSU. At the university's research ranch, Jesse French is a livestock manager, and he's breeding cattle that need less feed.
Feed efficiency is really looking at the input side of things. So they might be able to grow to the exact same weight, but one did it with 20% less feed.
In the university's test kitchen,
so this isn't retail ready as it is.
Undergrads work with professors to reduce waste at the butcher floor.
So we cut that and essentially have two halves.
And over in the laboratory, CSU meat safety students are infecting meat with salmonella and then testing new methods to kill off the disease. It's an important aspect of the meat supply. In the last decade, U.S. producers had to destroy about 40 million pounds of recalled meat every year. All of these efficiencies in feeding, butchering, and reducing food waste aim to reach one goal.
How do we feed more people at a lower cost and have a smaller impact on the environment all at the same time?
It's that environmental impact that has some people thinking about eating less meat, or even eliminating meat from their diet altogether. Some food developers are trying to give those people an option. The challenge? To make a meatless alternative for those who like the taste of the real thing. Devin Bruntz is the lead researcher in charge of developing Harmony Valley brand meat substitutes.
We worked with a lot of different ingredients, a lot of different soy products, different ingredients that would add bite to it when you cooked it up to kind of really give you that feel of a cooked beef.
Bruntz hopes his products can influence the market, but he won't be able to rely on vegetarians. Just 5% of Americans identified as vegetarian in a 2012 Gallup survey, and that number had hardly changed since the late 90s. Bruntz hopes to attract carnivores to his product, not to convert them to vegetarians, but to give them an alternative.
I think there is a huge trend of people just trying to eat healthier, so be it maybe they're not going to switch over 100%, maybe 20% of the time, people who now eat all meat are going to start eating different vegetarian products.
So what's the future? Probably more alternatives like soy or yak. But when it comes to feeding the world, researchers say the U.S. will be serving up beef, pork, and poultry.
If we're going to improve efficiency, increase production of food that not only will address North American needs, but it'll also address global needs, a big chunk of it's going to have to come from the Midwest of the United States.
Ranchers, researchers, and food producers are finding ways to meet that global need. And the real transformation might not happen in the United States, but maybe in those developing nations, as today's American plate goes global.
Tastes like a hamburger.
For the U.S. to do its part feeding the world, the agriculture industry will need to build on its past record of production. As you've seen, American farmers and ranchers say they're up to the challenge. Can they do it?
Pessimists argue, they look around and they say yields are slowing. Yield growth is slowing. There's lots of evidence about that. And they're saying that we're hitting the biophysical limits.
But the industry has a history of pushing beyond those limits, and optimists believe that will continue with new research and technology. Still, there are different ideas on how to proceed. Meat could go back to the basics and stay on grass or stay local. It might cost more, but some people put a high value on accountability and transparency. On the other hand, there are benefits to being big and capturing economies of scale. And while you can expect to find new kinds of meat, you can also bet that chicken, pork, and beef will stay at the top of the menu.
I think that as agriculture, it's not just about beef producers getting better and improving their utilization of resources, but it's everyone. We all have to get better. And in the end, we'll have a sustainable food supply for the population in 2050.
That's the challenge that lies ahead. Fulfilling the world's appetite for meat means making more than has ever been made before. Producers are making choices today that will decide what the future looks like. And those choices matter to the economy, to consumers, and to the environment. In the end, feeding the world isn't just about making enough meat. It's also about how that meat is made.